Be not afraid. Be not afraid. That's the phrase that is found the most in the Bible. There's no other clause that's used as often. They are words that Abraham believes he's being told when he needs to set out across a vast desert to the promised land. They're the words that Moses is reassured when he does not feel at all equipped to lead the people out of Egypt and back to that promised land. They're the words that we hear the angels say to the shepherds out on a hill on the night that Jesus is born. Do not be afraid. And they're also the words that come from Jesus' mouth after his resurrection when he meets Mary Magdalene in a garden and says, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. They're phrases that are always used when people are being asked to go to some new place, to leave where they are and go into some unknown. And I think they're very relevant for us now. Do not be afraid. Think about the three things that we're now grappling with, three enormous crises. It's not just the healthcare crisis, a COVID, a world pandemic. That would be awful enough by itself. But we're also dealing with the crisis that is about economic insecurity. Think of all the people who have suddenly lost their jobs in America, abruptly unable to know whether they can feed their kids, whether they can pay the rent. We're in an economic crisis. And the third, of course, is the crisis that we're grappling with our national identity. Who is this country that we are? How is it that we, 401 years after the first enslaved people were brought here, we're still grappling with a racial reckoning about fairness? And all of us who are white, look at a depiction of George Floyd murdered on film and say, I'm not treated that way by the police. So we're facing three crises, and in a way, I think some of us wonder if we'll even survive. That's what our fear is about. Can we survive this time? But the thing that I feel we are most being called to not be afraid about is not simply surviving and going back to the old normalcy. I think we're being called to be courageous and not afraid about moving to a new place, leaving where we are now, however comfortable or uncomfortable it is, and moving into that place where the United States could be, where we could become the country that we always feel sort of we've been destined to be. Do not be afraid. Who can we be as a country? In the Old Testament, the metaphor is that one I mentioned before about promised land. Can we go to the promised land? Can we become the promised land? Can we return to the promised land after we've been taken away from it? It's the arc of the three main stories. We take the patriarchs, Abraham going to the promised land, Moses returning to it, and then in the story we hear today, there has been an exile. The people have been taken away from their promised land for another time. And now they are found in Babylon, where they've been taken by the people who beat them in battle. But the issue that Isaiah is talking about is for the second generation that's been living there in Babylon. The first generation that knew the promised land has died. And now there's a second generation and a third generation there, and as time has gone on, they've been given rights in that new country of Babylon. We know that because many of the key stories in the Old Testament were written during that time while in exile. So clearly they're being able to religiously practice. It is a country where there is some prosperity. And so the question becomes for them, return to that old promised land? Why would we do that? Why would we leave this place in which we've grown to have some comfort? Why should we cross a barren desert? What's in it for us? And look, isn't one bird in the hand worth more than two in the bush? And so the prophet Isaiah, who is tasked with this question of talking to the Jewish people who are in Babylon and bringing them back again to the promised land, that place where they can be all that they have been meant to be in God's eyes. Isaiah is tasked with painting a picture of what it will be like, of convincing them that this is indeed where they are called next. And so he says two things. One, he says, God does not fool around. When God has a purpose, it will be met. There is the notion, says Isaiah, when God sends the water down and the snows down, they never return back up to heaven in the condensation until they have done their work where they have given water to parched land and have fed the crops that will grow and created seed for next year. How does Isaiah paint a picture of what this unknown land, the promised land, will be like for those who are in Babylon? It's a tall order. But he calls upon imagination, saying to the people, here's the picture I want to paint with my words of what we can be as a people back in Jerusalem. And I have this sign that's on my door here at Cape Cod. It says, imagination is evidence of the divine. Because imagination is what lets us think beyond what is now into what can be. And so Isaiah says to the people, I want you to envision what can be. I am going to tell you that all the trees of the field shall clap their hands. The mountains and the hills will burst into song. Instead of the thorn, you are going to have the tall cypress. Instead of the briar, you're going to have the myrtle tree. You shall know that you shall never be cut off, for God will send you out in joy and bring you home in peace. This is the promise that God gives to you. In the New Testament stories we hear, there's another metaphor that is used to talk about who are the people we could grow into. And there was disagreement about that, as we have today. One view was that held by the reigning religious leaders, and they thought that one should be like God as much as possible, and they defined God first and foremost as holy. Therefore, all the people were to be holy. They were to be pure. The upshot of this is that you could be more pure, more holy, dependent upon a number of factors. One was just how you happened to have been born and into what class. There were certain of the tribes of Israel that were considered to be more holy and more priestly. There also was the question of how much wealth you had. It was deemed likely that if you had lived a more pure life, you probably had more wealth. Moreover, if you were poor, you might not be able to adhere to all of the purity rules. Of course, how you behaved also affected whether you would be deemed pure or impure. And there were people who were outcasts, who were considered never able to become pure enough. The tax collectors certainly weren't. And even those who had any physical impairment, they were in a different category. They could not be considered pure. As a result of all of this, there was a hierarchy, a social hierarchy that was set up, and there were some who were deemed more righteous in God's eyes and others who were deemed less righteous. Jesus disagreed. He had a whole other way of thinking about how we can understand if we are acting as God would wish. And in his view, he said, be compassionate as God is compassionate. Compassionate is a wonderful word to understand. Sometimes we say be loving as God is loving, but that can sometimes be a bit abstract for some of us. What does that mean exactly? But compassion, we know that means to feel with. It's also a better word than be merciful as God is merciful, another translation we sometimes hear. Because as we use the word mercy today, it seems to imply that someone has done something wrong and you're going to be merciful to them, you're going to forgive them. Or it implies that you're in a position higher than they and you will bequeath mercy unto them. But Jesus said, be compassionate as God is compassionate. Feel with others. And that way, if we can do that, then we can learn what Jesus did. He opened the table to everybody, even all those impure people. He scolded anyone who would not share of their wealth. He brought people together across all sorts of divides. And he wanted justice. He wanted the care to be of the orphans and the widows. He wanted there to be a world in which everyone was treated equally because God has compassion on us all. In many ways, I think it's not that different than how we are today. You think about the main characteristic that I think we're waking up to here in America, at least one of them, is our conviction for individualism. There have been a number of commentators recently who've said we are the most individualistic country of any practically today, and there's a strength to that. We know that. It's a sense of our liberty and our freedom. It's something at King's Chapel we say we have the right to understand God in our own way. But there's a downside to that, too. It's not just what's been seen in this COVID epidemic where people say, I have the right to imperil you and not put on a mask. It's not just that. It's when we treat individualism as the highest and best value, like purity in Jesus' time. We tend to set up a hierarchy of who is deserving. Because in that view of individualism, we tend to equate how well you've done, how well you have succeeded, with how deserving you are. So if you're at the bottom ranks, you don't deserve much because individually you haven't been able to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Isn't that why our president has been so adamant to claim that all of his wealth is self-made, as if there's something to be tarnished in his reputation if it came through his father? There's such an adherence to this sense of we earn all we can by ourselves that we tend not to acknowledge what it is that we have inherited, the advantages we've had through connections or in other ways, the color of our skin, knowing that we who are white would never be treated the same way as those who are black need to fear being treated in our justice system all the time. If you take Jesus's model of saying be compassionate as God is compassionate, what would that mean for us and the new world that we would seek to create? One different than a system purely built on individualistic talents. I think we know it'd be one where healthcare is a right for everyone. It would be one where no child would need to go hungry. It'd be more like what happens in Boston right now in light of this crisis. Any child in Boston, 18 or under, is allowed free food. That's what the city has done because they've known that otherwise there'd be so many children going without. It would be land in which we would make sure that everyone had the same access to housing. We wouldn't have the results that we just saw this week in our Boston Globe, where there are people who cannot get the same apartment if they have a name that sounds black. They simply aren't shown the apartment by those who are offering them for lease. We would demand that everyone could have a home and have an affordable one. We would demand that no one needed to be imperiled when they became of old age. We would demand that there could be care for anyone who had need in ways far more generous than what we have. The standard of needing to prove your worthiness to receive based on your individual talent and toughness and might would no longer be what would be most prevalent. Instead, we would say, we want to be compassionate as God is compassionate. That a society is best judged by how it cares for those least able to care for themselves. And as for our racial divide, the best book I've read that I just finished this week was by Ibram Kendi. It's about being an anti-racist. He is coming here to Boston University, and I'm excited about what he may offer our city. His work, which is very compelling because he talks about his own journey, he says something that I think is not unlike the standard to which God might hold us. And that is, he says, on the one hand, there are racists. And a racist is someone who believes that if there are differences in two groups of people, in the outcomes, in the results, in what is happening in their lives now between blacks and whites, say, and if there are different wealth outcomes, if there are different educational outcomes, if there are different job levels as a whole taken across those two groups, if you believe that those are as a consequence of someone being black and inherent traits of being black, or being white and inherent traits of being white, then that's the definition of racism. To be an anti-racist, he says, is to fight for the policies that will make sure that's not true. That will not stop until we adopt policies that make sure that health outcomes are exactly the same for blacks and whites. Yes, there'll be some people who die at older ages and some who die at younger ages and both, but it cannot be that across the whole that blacks always on average die at a younger age than whites. That cannot be. But where's the rub, oh people of God? It's not unlike the people who were in Babylon who were being called back by God to the promised land. If we are called into that kind of a country that is more like who we could be and who many of us thought in many ways we were, based on liberty and equality, then what would it take? And like the people in Babylon, they thought first and foremost about what they might have to give up. For any of us who are comfortable, that might be our concern too. What is it that we would have to give up? Because you see, when there is systemic racism, when there's systemic economic divides, then there's going to have to be systematic changes. And it will be into the tax laws, and it will be into how our justice system operates. It will be how our schools are financed, no longer just by property tax in a local area, but more broadly supported by a much wider community, because we're committed to the education of all. It might require for some of us giving up something. But what God suggests to us and what Jesus envisions is that that will be where our deepest joy is, in living in the way that God had most fully imagined. It's said this way in the Beatitudes: blessed will be those who now are mourning, not just because of a death, but because they mourn over their inability to feed their kids and keep them safe. They will find laughter. And wouldn't that bring you joy? It is said in the Beatitudes where those who are poor will find that they are enriched. And won't that bring you satisfaction also? People of God, can we be not afraid? Can we be called into that new way of living, that these three crises, COVID and our concern for our economy and our concern for racial justice, can these three crises propel us into the best we have been always meant to be? Will we require it of ourselves? God has a vision, I think, of who we are called to be. And God says, will you come along with me? Be not afraid. I go before you always. Come follow me, and I will give you the deepest peace and rest. May peace.